Richard and I and our families thank you for coming to pray for and remember our Father. We also thank our family and friends who cannot be here and joined the Mass and will watch these words of remembrance via live stream, especially Frank's grandchildren who are not here. Granddad loved you very much, and we know you loved him. I have told many people in the last couple of weeks that there is a reason I have a vision of God as a loving and gentle Father, and that reason is Frank Dendwick. Frank was born in Winnipeg, December 1st, 1942, the oldest child of Frank and Nancy. He was known in the family as Frankie or Young Frank. Nancy and her infant son lived with her in-laws while her husband was away during the Second World War. My grandfather's return from the war was such a momentous event that it was my father's earliest memory. He was just a toddler, so didn't remember much, but had a clear memory of eating a banana, sitting on his grandfather's shoulders when his father arrived. When Frank was 4 years old, his brother Christopher was born. 5 years after Chris came their little sister Judith. When I asked my aunt and uncle how they'd describe their relationship with their big brother, neither one skipped a beat, and both said he was my protector. Anyone who met my dad will remember that he was not a big man at 5 feet 2 inches tall. He was always smaller than other kids his age, which meant that he took more than his fair share of bullying. He was strong for his size, but sometimes that wasn't enough, so in order to protect himself, he learned to fight dirty. He didn't want anyone he cared about to have to do the same, so he'd get between them and anyone he felt he had to. He never started a fight, and instead would offer, "You take the first punch." That didn't need to happen too many times before Chris and Judy didn't have to worry about bullies. Dad trusted Richard's natural abilities to defend himself. I, on the other hand, had private lessons in Frank-style fighting. Thankfully, I never had need to use this training, and I will spare you the details. But if it was a matter of life and death, someone could lose an eye. Frankie had an angelic face with those smiling blue eyes, but don't let that fool you. He had a mischievous side and could be the instigator of trouble. It was never to be malicious, but he loved to have fun and had a curiosity to learn how things worked. I wonder what will happen if I do this. Most stories are best told by my uncle, but I will share that my Uncle Chris told me he finds it amazing they both lived to be as old as they did. Frank loved being out in the bush from a very young age. The family would spend summers camping in a tent at Falcon Lake in Manitoba. Young Frank was not content in the confines of a tent and would drag his sleeping bag out to sleep under the stars so he could be one with nature, as he'd say. As a teenager, Dad worked in the warehouse of Eaton's department store and used his first savings to buy a canoe. By that time, my grandparents had built a cabin at Big White Shell Lake. Frank would take off for 2 or 3 days with his canoe, a sleeping bag, and a knife. My uncle says they have no idea what he ate. There were no cell phones to keep in contact, but his parents did not worry. They knew he was smart and resourceful, and he'd been sleeping outside since he was 8 years old. His father wondered why he had bothered to build a bedroom for him in the cabin because he never slept in it. Dad used to say that was where he found it easiest to pray. He felt closest to God in the outdoors. Anyone who had a conversation about faith with my dad probably heard him say that he did not fear death because he looked forward to giving Jesus a big hug. A couple of people have told me as much in recent days. Frank's love of the outdoors took him to the Maritime Forest Ranger School in Fredericton, New Brunswick, from which he graduated with honors in 1965. He then worked in forestry in Victoria, but found his way back to Winnipeg and started his career with the Canadian Forestry Service. This remained his employer until he retired in 1998. Dad loved his job, was very good at it, and made some lifelong friends at work. In 1970, several staff from Winnipeg were transferred to Edmonton. Like our parents, they had young children and no family in Edmonton, so they relied on each other. Even after retiring, they remained close and met regularly for breakfast or lunch, and because they were retired foresters and needed to be outside, they'd go for long walks together. A highlight every summer for my parents was the annual Retirees Barbecue and an opportunity to gather with old friends. You couldn't find two people more different than Frank and Lucille, but they loved each other and made it work. Frank met Lucille on a blind date in 1968. A friend of Mum's worked with Dad and thought they'd be a perfect match. Frank was smitten on the first date, and on the second date he said, "I'm going to marry you, you know." Mum told me that she asked, "Oh yeah? When?" The easiest season for a forester to have time off work is winter, so he replied, "How about February?" Their wedding was on February 7th, 1969, and they were married for almost 50 years until Mum passed away in 2018. Our dad thought our mum was the prettiest girl he ever saw. Once, after watching the Charlie Brown Christmas special, he remarked, "I realize I have something in common with Charlie Brown. We're both in love with a red-headed girl." They welcomed their first child, me, just months before leaving Winnipeg. Richard was born in Edmonton 2 years later. Our parents shared a love of reading and instilled this in Richard and I. Dad took us weekly to the library in the basement of Southgate Mall. He made sure we always signed up for the summer reading program because you could win a prize. Dad loved to enter contests and have the chance to win almost anything. Mum and Dad enjoyed long drives together. Their honeymoon was a road trip into the States. Richard and I remember many Sunday country drives. Dad's vacation time was usually used for road trips to visit our grandparents. After our parents retired, it was not uncommon for them to take advantage of a day with no plans to get in the car and head to a beach or park. Mum would bring a lawn chair and her book, and Dad brought his metal detector because it offered the chance to dig up a prize. Dad had a wonderful way with children. My brother or I would pass him one of his grandchildren, and before you knew it, that baby would be asleep in his arms. We have many photos of children playing with Granddad, Uncle Frank, or Mononcle Frank, depending on who you ask. One of his favorite titles was given by our cousin Renee when she was a little girl, "My good buddy, Uncle Frank." It was very common for a grandchild to ask, "Hey, Granddad, wanna wrestle?" He'd look at them, take off his glasses, and be met with squeals of delight. He was lots of fun as a father and loved to surprise us. There was often a chance we'd hear Dad make a noise or laugh from around a corner. We'd shriek and run, and the chase was on. Richard and I have good memories of bike rides, ravine walks, and Dad patiently playing board games with us, except for the game of life. He refused to play that game, saying it was enough for him that he had to worry about paying a mortgage in real life. He wasn't going to play a game about it. Dad was a good cook and enjoyed a fine meal. Emily shared a memory of being at her grandparents' home for lunch when Dad, as he was eating his soup, asked Mom, "What do you feel like having for supper?" He was always a meal ahead, and it drove our mother crazy, mostly because she hadn't thought about it. Dad was the planner and forward thinker in that relationship. Mom was the keeper of memories and treasures. Second to the outdoors, Frank's happy place was his workshop. Richard and I have great memories of time with Dad there. There was always background music in the workshop. He loved country western. Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, and Willie Nelson were favorites. If he wasn't listening to country music, it was because he'd put on some Neil Diamond. Dad patiently let us help when it was safe to do so, and we learned the important rules of measuring twice and cutting once. And you can bet we both unplug electric tools when they are not in use. To this day, nothing brings back happy childhood memories like the smell of the lumber department of a hardware store. If Lucille dreamt of something she wanted that could be made out of wood, Frank would make it. When she came home with a light-up Holy Family for the front yard, he built a stable for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And when they found a statue of St. Francis at a garage sale, Frank built him a chapel in the yard. Dad retired at the young age of 55. He remained busy looking after grandchildren and taking trips with Mum. He volunteered once a week at Anawim, the food bank run by the Sisters of Providence. When he learned that the nuns took the bus downtown to get to the food bank, he started leaving the house earlier so he could go to the convent to pick them up. He volunteered for about 3 years with the group responsible for building the 2 carousels at Fort Edmonton Park. He wasn't much of a carver, but sanded, painted, and helped with other tasks. Emily was a toddler, and one day Dad called and asked me to send him photos of her feet. The woman carving the cherub on a bench for the big carousel was having trouble with the feet and needed a model. Next time you go to Fort Edmonton, you can search the walls of the carousel house for the plaque with the names of all the volunteers, and maybe sit on Emily's bench and take a turn on the carousel. Dad was a dust angel, cleaning the church for years here at St. Thomas More. Pat Choma shared with me that she remembers when Dad first joined and explained to her that he had recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. His doctor had said it was important that he remain active. Vacuuming the church turned out to be great exercise, and he enjoyed the camaraderie of prayer, coffee, and fellowship with the other dust angels when they were finished their work. Sometimes when my children had a day off from school, Dad would pick them up on his way to the church, and they would help the dust angels. They didn't mind getting up early and helping because it meant time with Granddad. Dad wore his heart on his sleeve. This is one of the traits shared among the Dendwick men that I love most about them. Mom would have said the same. Dad smiled and laughed readily and could be easily moved to tears with emotion. Even sharing happy news from one of my cousins or about one of his grandchildren would bring on a twitch in his lip and misty eyes because of the deep love he felt for them. Dad was practical and accepted what he could control and didn't worry a lot about what he couldn't. When he was diagnosed with Parkinson's at the age of 69, he decided he should get comfortable taking the bus and anticipating the day would come that he couldn't drive. He got a bus pass and learned the routes to most places he needed to go. He gave up his license once he noticed his reflexes slowing. He said he couldn't live with himself if he ever hurt someone while driving and preferred to give it up by his own free will rather than have it taken from him. Lucille passed suddenly in 2018. Frank's life changed a lot then, because not only was he now a widower, but it was also evident to everyone, himself included, that he was not safe alone at home. Mom died in November, and it took until June for a room to become available at St. Joseph's Auxiliary Hospital, which was our first choice for continuing care. In the meantime, Dad lived in a facility in which he was the only resident without dementia. That was a very difficult time for Dad and our entire family. I have a memory of Dad from that time that exemplifies so well the type of man he was. One day, when I went to pick him up, he brought me to meet another resident he had befriended. She was frail and bedridden and was happy to meet Frank's daughter and hold my hand. When we got in my car, I asked him how he'd met her. Dad took regular walks around the building with his walker to stay active. One day, as he was walking, he heard her call out, "Is anyone out there?" I don't think anyone would have found fault with him if he had thought that he had enough troubles of his own at that time and kept on walking. But that was not Frank's way. Instead, when he heard, "Is anyone out there?" his response was to step into the doorway and say, "I'm here." After that, Dad stopped by her room every day for a visit. Dad's response to the people he loved was his presence. Whether it was a skinned knee, an imaginary monster under the bed, a bad haircut, or worse, a bad perm, a broken bone or broken heart, grief and loss, almost anything. Dad knew words weren't always important, and he had no magic wand. Frank's response was his presence, and of course, a little humor couldn't hurt. People were always impressed with Dad's positive attitude and no-nonsense approach to his illness. I've been thinking a lot about that lately and how it reveals so much about him. He was always practical and a realist, but when also seen through the lens of Dad's faith, it reveals that he had trust in God and confidence that the Lord was in control and would take care of him. Dad participated in many of the activities at St. Joseph's Auxiliary Hospital. A few days after he passed, the head of the recreation department called to tell me that a couple of her staff shared that on the day he died, he had ice cream on the patio, which is a regular activity in summer months. One of them said that she sat at Dad's table that day, and he ate his ice cream with no assistance, which was unusual in the last year or so. And she remarked that he seemed unusually happy. And she had been really struck by how very happy he was. It gave Richard and I a lot of comfort to know that Dad had spent his last hours in the shade with some ice cream on a warm August afternoon and had had a happy day. He would have said that life doesn't get a lot better than that. At the end of that happy day, he got to give Jesus a big hug. I hope this gives others who knew and loved our Dad comfort too.